Arguments of the Greats, debates between Sappho, Aristotle, Dante, and Machiavelli on who contributed the most to culture, by Kaitlynn Wolffe, Bach, Laci Dezern, and Grace Honeycutt.
The host stood at the head of the table as their guests chatted over tzatziki and pita chips. Thank you all for coming. I know it must have been a long journey for all of you. The room becomes silent as the host speaks. You must be wondering why I invited you all here. I will explain, but first I would like you all to introduce yourselves and your works, as well as mention someone who has inspired you and your works. The host gestures to their right, where a Grecian woman sits in ancient robes. I suppose I am first. I am called Sappho of Lesbos. I authored poems such as Let's Not Pretend, Very Well, Charaxus, and many, many more. My inspiration is Anactoria, one of my favorite people in the world, Sappho stated in her lyric tone. Also, I must say, this tzatziki is delicious.
Is that what this is?
The man across from her said, taking another bite of a pita chip.
Fascinating. I am Aristotle, a student of Plato. I wrote Politics and Poetics.
The host gestures to the man sitting next to Sappho.
Oh, I'm next.
The man in red and black robes takes a sip of wine and speaks.
My name is Dante Alighieri of the Florentine Empire. I wrote the Divine Comedy. My mentor and guide is Virgil of Rome. I am also a renowned artist. You can thank me for all of the new depictions of hell,
he said with a proud smile. Thank you, Dante. Last but not least, the host gestures to the man in black robes. The man sits up straight and addresses the table with the strong voice of a diplomat.
I am Niccolo Machiavelli of Florence, Italy. I am best known for my works in politics and in war, and am inspired by Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI. I can also be considered the founder of political science as you know it today. It is a pleasure and an honor to be dining here tonight.
Machiavelli had a politician's grin stretched across his face as he spoke to the group. The host nodded in greeting. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you, everyone. The host held up their glass of wine as they spoke. Now, on to the main subject of the evening. I have a question for all of you to discuss as we dine. Who here has made the greatest contributions to culture? Aristotle is the first to interject.
How would you define culture? We cannot debate this unless we know how you define what culture is. I believe some context is needed.
The host ponders for a moment before answering. I would say, culture is defined as the collective creations of humanity, the works that humans create and how they influence modern ideals and individuals. The host then gestures to Sappho. Since our first course is based on your time period, I believe it would only be fitting for you to begin, my lady. Aristotle mumbles under his breath.
Why does the lesser sex receive precedence?
Sappho lets out a dry cough to punctuate it is her turn to speak. Well, a theme I have placed throughout my work is that of beauty. In my time, beauty was analogous to military power, but in my poetry, I focused more on the beauty of individuals and the relationships between them. For example, I wrote a poem about my lover Anactoria and the beauty of her form. Dante inquisitively asked,
Ah, so you write of romance.
Sappho tilted her head in thought. I do not only write about romantic love, but also platonic and familial love. For instance, in Very Well, Charaxus, I schooled my brother on his greed and thirst for power. I wrote this because I love him, and I feared that he would take a dark path if he continued. On a lighter note, I also wrote poetry to my pupils in Lesbos, showing my platonic love to my students by passing down my knowledge and ensuring they would prosper even after I was gone. So, in a bit of a conclusion, can you briefly summarize what you think you have most contributed to culture? The host asks politely. Sappho gives a slow nod. Of course, I've contributed to culture by challenging the definition of beauty and love in my society. Dante remarked in reverence.
I very much admire your literary work, Sappho. Writing your poetry in your own meter takes much skill. Your literary prowess is inspiring.
Why, thank you. It is encouraging to see that people have found my works and can relate to it, although we are centuries apart. The host interjects. I would like to inform you that many of your works have inspired and touched the hearts of many feminists and members of the homosexual community. Aristotle cocks his head in confusion.
What is feminism? Is it a support group for women?
The host furrows their eyebrows, knowing the conversation will soon turn into arguing. Essentially, Feminism in the 21st century is a supportive stance made to support women that are facing adversity. Any person, male or female, can be a feminist.
Ah.
Aristotle is mostly silent. He opens his mouth to speak again when Sappho cuts him off. "That's wonderful," she exclaims, clasping her hands together in excitement. "I am pleased to see that my hard work has helped so many women in the future." As Sappho finishes her argument, the table divulges into chatter as the lentil soup is brought out. The host places down the last bowl of lentil soup and speaks. "Now we have a dish from Dante's time, lentil soup. As you enjoy your food, Dante, would you mind explaining how you contributed to culture, as well as why you think you did the best?" Dante, after taking a sip of his soup, begins.
Absolutely. The kitchen has done a lovely job with this soup, by the way.
The host bows silently and gives a smile. Dante clears his throat.
Now, for my contributions, I wrote the famous epic, The Divine Comedy, and I also painted many of the modern-day representations of the Christian afterlife, also known as hell.
Machiavelli lets out a small laugh.
Based on your works, my friends and I must be going to your hell, then.
Dante gives a nervous smile.
Well, you see, the politicians I have met have not been particularly good people. I'm sure you understand.
Aristotle interjects.
Well, I must also fear for my soul.
Dante nods and continues his monologue.
The Divine Comedy has influenced modern depictions of hell and purgatory, expanded Christian lore, and inspired many authors such as John Milton with Paradise Lost and Martin Luther's 95 Theses.
Dante smiles to himself.
You could say I alone planted the seed for diversification in Christianity.
As Dante's argument reaches an end, the next course is brought out, the patina lucretiana, a dish of pork which has been glazed with herbs, is rolled, and is then baked. The host, returning to the head of the table, gestures to Aristotle. Now, with this dish from Aristotle's time, it is Aristotle's turn to speak. Aristotle puffs his chest with pride.
Yes, of course, it is my turn to speak. I'm a student of the great philosopher Plato. With my education, I have written many works in my time. I have written plays as well as discussed politics in my writings. One may recognize me for my work in creating the concept of tabula rasa, or blank slate, as well as logos, or logic. I even went so far as to found my own school in the Lyceum.
Machiavelli nods in approval.
Would you care to tell us more about your works in politics?
Aristotle smiles.
Absolutely. My work focused on what qualified as a good government and the good and the bad aspects of each. Essentially, all governments aim to have some good in them. However, sometimes that is not the case. Governments can be unfavorable for preserving a constitution, yet the same could be said for the opposite. Government can be both good and bad. It just depends on how each man views it. This would also depend on how the government benefits each person. For example, my protege, Alexander the Great, used government to his advantage and conquered much of the known world. On the other hand, Socrates was murdered by his government. It depends on a multitude of factors, and therefore my work cannot be determined as either good or bad as a whole.
Before Aristotle could continue, the dessert was brought out. Machiavelli smiled as he saw it was sambacad, otherwise known as elderberry cheesecake.
I am guessing it is my turn?
Machiavelli faintly smirked as the slice of cheesecake was placed in front of him. Yes, please enjoy your sambacad while Machiavelli makes his argument. The host used the arrival of dessert as a smooth transition.
Thank you, host.
Machiavelli composes himself and takes on a diplomat's presence.
As the founder of political science, I have separated religion and morality from politics. I best articulate my ideals in The Prince.
Aristotle interrupts to ask between bites.
What is political philosophy? It is less of a philosophy and more of a truth. Politics and politicians need to be aware of the public's view, but ultimately do what is best for the nation, even if it means deceiving the public. Cesare Borgia is a notable example of the ideals described in The Prince, except even he relied too much on luck rather than intellect or strength.
Machiavelli spoke as the others ate their cheesecake. Dante looks over at Machiavelli and comments.
Separating religion and politics was a smart move, as both are easily corruptible on their own. Together they can easily drag people to hell. I just took what I saw people do rather than what others say they ought to do,
Machiavelli stated.
Politics has shown itself to be best represented when amoral.
As the meal comes to an end, the guests collect their thoughts on everyone's arguments, and they long for an answer to the question, who has contributed the most? Sappho, placing her silverware neatly beside her plate, speaks up. So, host, who would you say contributed the most? I believe you would be unbiased in your conclusion. The host looks to the guests in thought. Well, I believe every one of you has contributed greatly to culture. Where Machiavelli has contributed to politics, Aristotle has contributed much to philosophy. Sappho, you have made beautiful poetry, and Dante, you have contributed greatly to the Christian mythos. However, all of your contributions simply cannot be equated to one another. You all have contributed so much, but to different subjects, which are equally important. Dante furrows his brow.
So what do you mean?
The host smiles, trying not to upset the guests. In a way, you have all contributed equally to separate things. Since these things cannot be compared, you all have contributed the most, just to your own fields. The four notice that their bodies are becoming faint. They look up in confusion to the host. The host smiles and eases their confusion with a final goodbye. Thank you all for being here for this wonderful debate. I am now sending you back to your own time periods. You won't be able to remember this event, but just know that the significance of this meeting will ripple throughout time.
The end.